I am Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Susie.
And we're paranormal specialists who live in the most haunted city on earth, Savannah, Georgia. Every day is Halloween in our line of work, so join us as we spin true tales of haunts, murders, and disturbing Savannah history. I'm Madison.
I'm Chris.
And welcome to the most haunted city on earth. Hello and welcome to season 3 of the most haunted city on earth. My name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Susie.
And we have Eenie with us because we are going to be doing every season opener with Eenie to do our favorite ghost stories, which seems to be everybody's favorite episode. Yeah. So woohoo! Also, Happy New Year, y'all.
Happy New Year!
Woohoo! Yes. What made people want a baby as the logo or
because
character
old man, the baby actually grows to be an old man in the course of a year. Oh. So, the baby New Year and then, old man, winter or whatever.
Old man.
Which is kind of creepy. Yeah. Old man's hey, I'm getting out of here.
Yes, dropping babies from the top of New York buildings.
Well, no, whoa. This went dark
is that
fast.
What confetti is?
That's what
No! Stop! We do not condone the dropping of babies.
Just not in New York.
At any height.
Yes.
Don't drop your babies.
Well, enough of the baby talk, but let's go ahead and do some announcements. So bear with me here. I got a few. But for, like I said, season 3, we're going to start it off every season from now on with Eenie doing My Favorite Ghost Stories. Also, we have restructured a bit. So this is going to change for people who are just listening on whatever platform you're listening to that's not Patreon. So everybody who's getting free content, we are going to be reducing back a little bit to just 1 full hour episode a week that will come out on Tuesdays. And then we're going to do a mini episode every week on Saturdays. And with that, though, we are going to have a lot more fan interaction. We're going to have more guests and stuff. So they're going to be beefy episodes. Don't worry. But if you are a para-junkie over on Patreon, then that means that you will have the same amount of content that you were getting before. So that's 3 to 4 extra episodes. And if you are in the 2 higher tiers, that means that you get an extra episode every month. So that's pretty cool. So if you want all the fun extra content and extra episodes and stuff, maybe check out our Patreon. Also, for Para-Junkies over on Patreon, we are going to be doing a Para-Junkie Day. Woohoo! We have made our own holiday.
Yes.
So that is going to be a live stream ghost party for all Para-Junkies, even the ones who chose to just do the $3 support button. So you will also be included on that. And we'll give you more details to that when we get a little bit closer to a date that we want to do this. But just something to look forward to as you get your own holiday and things like that. So I believe that is all the announcements that I have for today's episode. Also, make sure to check out our website for blog posts because JT and I have been working on writing some fun, ghostly blog posts. So if you want to read content, that is where you should go.
When I was a kid, TV was called books.
Yes. I still am a bookworm, so I am elderly, I guess. But anyways, so let's go into our favorite ghost stories. It's been a while since we've done this. So, Eenie, first off, would you like to introduce yourself for people who haven't heard you at this point? So,
hi, I'm Eenie Edenfield, Eenie to most people, and I live here in Savannah, Georgia. Been here since 2010. Used to work in news. During the pandemic, I started sharing ghost stories on TikTok, and that kind of took off. When things started opening up, people started asking for in-person tours, and I was like, oh, I should start a business now. So I've been the proud owner and operator of Eenie Edenfield Tours for a little over a year now.
Excellent.
Yes.
Tell us all your tags and your places to be found.
Yes. I am on TikTok, Salt Waves, Spanish Moss. I'm on Instagram, Eenie Edenfield. Eenie is spelled Eenie. I also have Patreon. Definitely check out.
Drop your Patreon. Drop your Patreon.
But also, I am Enika Edenfield on Patreon.
Excellent.
Yes. Awesome. So with that though, you have had lots of experiences since the last time you've done a My Favorite Ghost Stories episode. So do you have one in particular you would like to share with the group?
So do you want to talk about Savannah or do you want to talk about other places?
Your favorite. I think that what's happening is we've definitely broadened our scope to allow for, ghost stories, because there are compelling ghost stories everywhere.
So I have family that moved up to Ohio, around the Columbus area. And there are two things that I will always drag people to if I go to visit somewhere. We're going to a cemetery and we're going on a ghost tour. It might be me just dragging you around a haunted places with a book going, oh, and this ghost haunts this place. But we're doing both. And recently, I went back up to visit some family, and it was actually my sister who decided to take us on a ghost tour. And the ghost tour guide, fantastic guy, was showing us around haunted Columbus, and he stopped out in front of where a hotel used to be, and he starts telling this story. And it started ringing some bells because it reminded me a lot of Little Gracie here in Savannah. Little Gracie was born and raised at the Pulaski House Hotel that used to be off of Johnson Square. She passed away really young from an illness, and she's buried out in Bonaventure Cemetery with a headstone that is her likeness. The ghost tour guide started telling us about a boy, I believe his name was Little George. And George grew up at this hotel. His parents ran it. And one day he ended up falling down the stairs, I believe, and lingered for several days until he passed away. And he's buried out at one of the larger cemeteries in Columbus. And he also has a headstone that is his likeness. Ooh. And just like Little Gracie, people also leave gifts there in front of his grave. In fact, the cemetery owners, I don't know what to call them, have put a sign out in front saying, please stop leaving gifts on the headstone. If you want to leave gifts for him, we have a box in the lobby of our building that you can leave the gifts in. Because just like with Little Gracie, they had a problem with people touching the headstone and doing damage to it. But a lot of people in Columbus report seeing Little George running around where that hotel used to be. And some people say that they will see him cross the street over to where there's an old theater now. But it was just really interesting to me. Like once he started telling the story, I'm like, this is really weird because a lot of it matches up with Gracie here. And I looked it up, and this is an actual kid. It wasn't something that he made up. So it's really interesting that two different parts of the country, two different children, but they're weird similarities in their lives and in their subsequent hauntings.
Yeah, that's really cool. And yeah, to have so many startling similarities is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. So for some of our viewers who are from Ohio, because I know we have a few, there you go. You should go visit Little George because
there you go.
So did you look up if he died like after Little Gracie or if...
I don't remember. I know it was around the same time period.
Sure.
Little Gracie died in 1889. Little George would have died somewhere at the end of the 1800s or early 1900s.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because my theory, it was like maybe, he died and his family had visited Savannah at some point and maybe saw Gracie Watkins is like...
Well, there's a familiarity to that ghost story anyway. Mm-hmm. Especially the concept of children ghosts. Children are persistent ghosts. Like when a child dies, and my theory is basically we grow up, and as we mature, we are told all these things about death. We're given rituals about death. We're explained things about death, and we come to some idea of what happens when you die because that's what mortality is, one long musing about death. A child does not have that. So when a child dies, it doesn't register as death. It registers as more life, just different. You know, all of a sudden, I can walk through a wall. That's fun. You know, all of a sudden I'm playing a long game of hide and seek, you know, and so children ghosts are oftentimes the most interactive. They are the most physical. You know, they can touch, pull, get your attention. And I think that is something that across the board becomes. And so when you talk about a hospitality place, a place where children are so geared towards greeting people, you know, not being afraid of strangers, being very outgoing. You know, most hotel children understand transients, understand people coming and going. So they are, you know, Gracie is said to be seen waving to people as they drive by the square. And that kind of thing, I think, is, you know, not typical of the period. When you think of children, there's been a long-standing seen, not heard, you know, never interrupt. But in a hospitality place, the child is, you know, quick to say hi to people and quick to be involved in people. So yeah, I think that that the fact that their life story is so similar makes sense that their ghost story would be so similar.
Right. Well, and it's a weird concept in general to make a headstone look like the person who it's like, you know, who died, because it's like, it almost feels that they're trying to keep that person there.
Oh yeah.
Because,
absolutely.
you know, when it's your likeness, I mean, that has an essence of you to a degree.
Even Gracie's was an artist who was compelled to do it, you know, and the concept there is exactly what you said, this desperation to hold on because the tragedy of a child dying is so big. Because in fact, I've come across a lot of like infant graves that have infants like carved onto the stone, and it is a we need to keep the soul, you know, the spirit, the love, and so they make these representations of these past children. So
losing a child is tough. I'm not a mom, but from what I've seen with other people, like the loss of a child is like one of the worst losses you can go through,
absolutely.
And you do everything you can to try and hold on to that little bit, which is why there are some parents who, like if their child dies, they do not touch that child's bedroom. That child's bedroom is
sacred,
is, you know, a memorial to
they
them.
even make mourning dolls.
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, which is fascinating, and not to underscore the therapeutic value of it, but it scares me. You know, I myself get very like uneasy with the idea. First, a doll is kind of, you know, right on the line of being creepy no matter what. But then when you have a doll that is, you know, by feature and by even like wearing the clothes of the deceased child, that begins to give me a little, you know, those are called the woogity woogities. Yeah. Woogity woogities are internal, oogity boogities are external.
Yeah.
Mourning is also just a weird process, because
it
we
is,
all
grief is,
go through our own process and our own coping skills. And what works for you might be really weird to me.
Right.
Absolutely. And
and
I would never prescribe to anyone the course of action, but I know that in particular mourning dolls give me the woogies.
It's just personally for me, it's like a textural thing for them. They're really gross feeling because we used to have one. And I feel like we probably still have it somewhere. But when we had an Alice Riley scene at the Savannah Underground, we gave her a mourning doll because it's an immersive scene. So you don't want the baby doll to look like super baby-like, you know, like baby doll-like, I should say. You want it to look more realistic. So we bought a mourning doll. That thing, if I get they're trying to like replicate the pudginess of a baby.
Oh, is it squishy?
It's squishy, and I don't like that. And I'm
fleshy.
I'm just like, ugh, that's what creeps me out. I just also hate dolls, but you know, it's just it's like a ew, like your ew kind of thing when you touch them. But regardless, on to the other side of what I was going to actually say before I thought about our mourning doll, was that even during times where infant mortality was really high, people weren't even naming their kids until they got to a certain age, to just show how, like, you know, deeply people were worried about having to go through that process. They were it's easier to lose a child that you never even really bonded with, but because you called them baby or son or daughter or whatever you called them. So you can go, in Savannah in particular, to a lot of the infant graves or young children graves, and it will just say baby, or it will say infant of mom and dad's name, things like that. So, you know, and I think it would just made it a little bit easier for people. They started the mourning process because they just anticipated that it was very likely that it could happen. They started the mourning process like from the day of the child being born, which just says a lot about the mental state that era of people were in.
The type of fortitude that was going on there.
Right.
They were like, oh, well, you know, if the child makes it to 2, we'll give it a name.
Right. I think it was like 4 or 5 sometimes people would wait until they got to that age because they're like, their immune system's just good enough that they might be able to fight off scarlet fever.
Well, walking around Bonaventure or Laurel Grove, but you definitely see it a lot at Bonaventure. John Waltz, who also did Little Gracie's headstone, did several other children's graves, and another one is 2 children. Like the 5-year-old and then like an infant. And they were sisters, but they were born and died at 2 different times. And the family waited until the second child had died to have this headstone created for both children. And you see that with several other headstones as well. They'll wait till like all the kids have passed, like they're past 12. Okay, the kids who died before these kids, now we'll get them a headstone.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's one headstone for like 3 children.
Yeah. I mean, well, you see that even with families in general in cemeteries a lot. You'll just see, like, especially for families that didn't have as much money, because if you didn't know, funerals are very expensive.
And so are headstones.
Right. And they've always been that way. So a lot of families couldn't afford, for the entire family to get a headstone one day. So they were like, we're just going to buy one big one and we'll just keep adding to it, And it was the same way on crypts and stuff too. You'll notice on some of they'll have like 2 like headstones built into the crypt, and it'll just have names of all the people who are inside the crypt. We're just dust people now, but that's well, it's kind of true.
As opposed to dust bunnies.
Yeah, they are not dust bunnies. They are dust people, and because I've always loved the imagery of Imagine the job of being the person that has to go in there into those crypts with the new body, the new family member, and they've got to be like, Dorothy, she's all bones now. Got to just wipe her off the slab. And so it's to put her into the ossuary. It's like, I've always imagined that. I'm like, how horrible of a job. You're like, oh God, like you were a mess. A lot of dust.
You're barely held together. Come on.
Keep it together, girl.
Yes. Because that's essentially what they did was, once that's how they made room for all those family members was they would have the slabs and stuff. And once the person was fully decomposed, they could just go into the ossuary, which is just a mixture of all the other relatives, a soup of relatives, if you will.
Lovely. Well, what's even weirder is the fact that there are inexplicable bodies that don't decompose at the same rate or for some reason. So could you imagine going down and they're like, oh no, this one's still occupied. I don't think I can just put this one away. It's looking pretty good for 100 years dead.
Right. Well, and that's why they added the limestone a lot into crypts because limestone helps kind of accelerate the process a little bit. Because you want it to especially if it's a smaller crypt, but you got a lot of family members, you're like, okay,
more bang for your buck.
Right. And so that was really common, especially in Savannah. I always imagined, how Sherman's cavalry, they would stay in Colonial Park Cemetery a lot, and they would sleep in the crypts. So I'm just like, just imagine how cold you had to been even though I'm like, y'all are from the north, so like, and it's the winter in Savannah. It shouldn't have been that bad, but they would literally go into the crypts and sleep in them because they had slabs, human-sized slabs. It's like perfect. It's a bunk bed, you know, and that's what they did.
Yeah, if you ever come to Colonial Park Cemetery and you see these, they look like rooftops.
They do.
Know that there used to be stairs that went down into these crypts. They're not just what you see, because people are like, how can you fit a family there? No, they're much larger than they look. We had to fill them in because, I think as late as the 80s, people were still able to like get down into them, and people suck.
True.
People would take things. They would get things. I think there's one story of a kid who like was running around the cemetery with a sword.
As one does.
And he had broken into one of the things and took a sword from one of the bodies that was, military funeral, and was running around with a sword. And I was like, well, there's several things wrong with this picture.
Right.
And those entryways also fill up with water. There's still at least one out at Laurel Grove where you can still see the steps down. And if we have a heavy rain, that fills up.
Just fills up with water,
and mosquitoes.
Right. And some murky dead bodies.
Yes. Well, and I'm sure people were trying to sleep in them for shelter and things like that, which I would just like to say, don't do that. Maybe don't try to camp out in the crypts. Bloody Mackenzie's spirit. His story started with a guy who was homeless in Edinburgh, and he tried to sleep in the crypt, and then he fell through to like this dungeon area of his mausoleum and whatnot. And that's what people like to say is what unleashed Bloody Mackenzie was. That I don't like personally. I think it's because he's buried on top of a bunch of people he murdered, but
details.
He likes to take his work with him.
Right. That's so ironic, is it not? That out of all the cemeteries in Edinburgh in general, and they were like, you know what? It would be really funny if we took this awful man who made a concentration camp in this kirkyard, and we're just going to bury him right into the middle of it. That's
They wanted his spirit to have a little company.
That's a choice.
Didn't they also have to completely seal that one up?
They did.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's funny. You can't. There's only one tour company that's allowed to go to that mausoleum at night, because the kirkyard is open. If I remember correctly, the kirkyard's open at night, but that area you can't get over to because so many people have so many awful experiences with Bloody Mackenzie, where they get injured, they've been scratched and maimed and things like that. And the one tour company, the only reason why they have express permission is because they begged the city. They're like, please, can we take people here? It's a big part of the history of the city. And even them, or that company, they've had wild occurrences happen to them where they had in their office, they had a fire that started out of nowhere. And at the same time that their office was on fire, the owner of the company's house was on fire during that same period. And there was no kind of explanation of why it caught fire. So don't mess with Bloody Mackenzie, the very angry poltergeist. So
don't mess with anyone whose nickname is Bloody.
Bloody, yeah.
Right.
Once you get to once you've earned the moniker Bloody,
right,
steer clear.
Yeah,
steer clear.
Which I think that was JT and I's favorite ghost of 2022. We have referenced it so many times because he's one of those poltergeists that I'm just how are you that active, But probably because he's got a big surge machine behind him.
Sure.
So
that makes perfect sense.
So there you go. But that's probably my favorite ghost story of
there
2022.
Well, what a smooth and seamless transition.
Yes, and if you haven't listened to my whole thorough breakdown of Bloody Mackenzie, go way back to the very early start of this podcast to From One to Wicked episode, and I did a thorough research on Bloody Mackenzie. So if you want to hear more about that, go there. But because I'm not going to reiterate it for you here for the people who did listen to that episode. But Chris, what's your favorite ghost story?
Well, if we're going just by the year of 2022, I spent the night in the Lizzie Borden house.
Oh, yes.
And that had numerous things. Probably one of the most interactive ghost hunts I've ever been on was at the Lizzie Borden house. But the story that stuck out and still kind of like is a thorn in my brain is that so Lizzie Borden house is actually Lizzie Borden's father combined. It was a single property where there are two houses, and then he combined the two houses into one household and built this house that is now the Lizzie Borden house. This came up so casually, and I was like, why don't I know more about this? So much so that I've seen a Lizzie Borden movie in the past, so I know that somewhere in my brain this story was there. But for the life of me, whenever I think of Lizzie Borden, I never think of this. So Lizzie Borden, of course, people who are familiar with Lizzie Borden, an accused axe murderess who murdered her parents, or her father and her stepmother. So that's enough. That's pretty twisted. But what no one talks about is that a generation earlier, there was an Eliza Borden. Mm-hmm. And Eliza Borden threw her 3 children into the well under the house and then slit her own throat with a straight razor. This came up in trial because they were trying to suggest that there was something in the blood. There was a familial, illness going on that caused women to murder. And it turned out that she was not blood. She married into the family. And that was kind of how that whole argument, but it came and went, and nobody talks about it. And I'm like, but what?
Right.
On the property, a woman threw 3 children into a well. 2 of them drowned. 1 of them survived, which is also horrifying to think about. And then she took her own life in one of the most graphic and terrifying ways, slitting her own throat with a straight razor. Bizarre. Not really being in tune with that story. Like, it kind of ambushed me. I was like, what? Why isn't that discussed more? Why don't they talk about that? Because in a lot of ways in my mind, it's worse than, the axe murder that happened. I mean, the axe murder is dramatic, I guess, but it's a mother killing her children and then herself, and at a time, of course, where postpartum depression was not even a consideration, like a woman's feelings at all were not a consideration. Right. Lizzie Borden actually was acquitted because they believed that a woman couldn't be as ferocious as that. That a woman couldn't possibly use an axe. Yeah, a little lady. Let her go. She's just a little lady. So is it just one? They're in Massachusetts, and we're like Southern lawyers pulling out our Southern lawyer accent. But the night I spent in there, they put us in this attic. That was the room we stayed in, with a toy box full of toys.
Ew.
And during the ghost investigation, there was this, and they were doing the Estes method. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Estes method, it's basically they take a person, they separate them from the group, and they put headphones on attached to a spirit box. And the spirit box is going up and down a radio, and words are being, aggregated from radio broadcasts, or voices are being heard, however you want it to go. So the person doing the listening is sitting there, and she starts saying upstairs, 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 upstairs over and over again, which is odd because if you're listening to a radio, why would any radio broadcast say upstairs repeatedly? Plus, how would it happen over a scanning, as you're scanning, because you're listening to multiple radio stations. So it was just one of those things. So the guide, the person who was leading the investigation, was like, oh, you know what? I know what this is. You're asking about the attic, the uppermost attic room. And it was like, yes. And I was like, oh, okay. And so me and my wife were like, oh, that's our room. And so then it said, come play with us. Come play with us. No. Come play with us. And it was
Megan.
Like, and we're just like, yeah, all right. And it's like, the man with the beard, the bearded man, the man with the beard. And I was like, that's me. I was like, come play with us. Come play with us. So I got up to go into the room where the woman is doing the essays, because I figure that's what's being asked of me. I get up, I start walking, and she says, the other one too. The other one. So Megan gets up and we go and we sit in the room and they're like, what shall we play? And we're like, oh no. But it was very intriguing because throughout that night, the spirit box was just going crazy. The things that it was saying, there was a point where it was like, it'd say like two redheads. And our friends are dating, but they're fiery redheads. It was like two redheads. And then it said, no, wait, three redheads. And again, spirit box is going up and down, but this is what the person's saying. So we're going through this. And at this point, someone in the room is like, no, there is only two redheads. And the husband of the woman who is listening to the box says, my wife is a redhead. She dyed her hair black. And I was like, oh, that's weird.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating. We were just fascinated by the whole evening. So, and it sparked this interest. And I'm feeling before the end of the year, I'm going to spend the night at the Conjuring House because it's such a fascinating access to points that are internationally renowned and internationally celebrated. And now they're letting you stay the night in these places. So, I would say that just the idea of having access to these haunted locations with kind of this open-mindedness, because forever, if you had a haunted location, you either kept a cap on it, you were like, Savannah's one of the only towns that I really saw embrace its ghosts. And that's, again, when we called this podcast The Most Haunted City on Earth, it was more about how we approach ghosts than it was the number or volume of ghosts. It was because I don't know of any other place that is or has been, because I think that Savannah kind of led the way with this boom of ghost tours, because before you might find one ghost tour, like, Salem, maybe New Orleans, but now you can go to Columbus, Ohio. You can find yourself in the middle of nowhere, and there's a guy running his little ghost tour, because every town, every city, every place has celebrated ghost stories, celebrated creepy stories, horrible crimes that they can, manipulate into a storytelling adventure for people. So, I'm excited about that. So I will say that for 2022, the Lizzie Borden experience was my favorite ghost story of the year.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's just a fun experience to have in general. So, I mean, I could totally agree that should be your 2022 story. But it is so true though about Savannah that, like, we have always as a city really embraced our dark history. Like, I've mentioned it before, but, even in Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, where they have the scene where they go out to Bonaventure to drink their martinis and stuff, one of the characters says, like, to understand Savannah, you have to understand our dead. Mm-hmm. And so that's very accurate, because we kind of treat our dead like they still are alive in a degree,
Well, yeah, and it really tells you how the city maintained, because it was the woman with the painted face. We cover our blemishes. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways we cover our blemishes is we tell these ghost stories of oftentimes horrendous action, but in the end, we've made it almost, a genteel experience. Oh, my house is haunted. Is your house haunted? Oh, poor dear, you don't have a ghost in your house? Oh, no.
And people do in Savannah just
Absolutely.
like openly talk about it. Last weekend, my spouse and I were downtown. He went over to the rail, which we did not realize was in the middle of SantaCon.
Oh.
And, yeah. And I can't deal.
Genuinely scary.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can't deal with that many people in such a small space. So I said, you can stay here, hang out with your friends. I'm just going to go walk around. And I had ended up in... there's that area of City Market where they have art galleries on either side of St. Julian. And I had gone upstairs. I'm just walking around, just killing time. And the section that I walked into, almost all the galleries are closed except for one. And I didn't want to be rude because I knew they had seen me walk past. So I decided to, duck in. And we start talking, and I mentioned that I have my own ghost and history tour company, and the owners just start telling me about all the experiences that they had in that building. And I didn't ask.
Right.
They just offered.
Oh, yeah.
And people do that all around Savannah. They love to talk about their experiences, especially if they find out that you're willing to listen.
Oh.
And that
Yes.
is very unique to Savannah. You do also get it in New Orleans as well. But in Columbus, Ohio, when my sister and I did that tour, the tour guide and another guy who was local to Columbus were talking about how hard it was to get people to talk about their ghost experiences, because you get all these places who are like, oh yeah, that building's definitely haunted, that building's definitely haunted. Oh, cool. Well, what's it haunted by? Oh, well, we don't want to talk about it.
Well, and to the point, growing up, I never told my ghost stories until I knew a person really well. The idea of telling strangers my ghost stories was always like, well, that's just going to brand me like a lunatic.
Right.
Exactly.
You have to be guarded. And the fact that Savannah was so open to listening to ghost stories and sharing ghost stories was like, well, I do have a lot of ghost stories. I do have a lot of experiences. But I was still very hesitant to tell any ghost story that was personal or any ghost story that was, something I experienced. And still to a certain degree, I find myself hesitant to just dive into new people. Like, you meet a person, it's like, I gotta wait to see how they'll respond to this, series of stories or this part of my life. It's the shameful corner of secrets. It's like, oh yeah, no, I'm not a ghost hunter. I don't know what are you talking about? No, I just like to ghost. But it's interesting because Savannah, it was, I was friends with one of the pioneers of the ghost tours in Savannah. And he was so flamboyantly open about ghosts, and he was so happy about it. And I want to say that at the time, it was Ghost Walk, Ghost Talk was the only ghost tour in town. And he was just a joyous, these are the ghosts. And he was very excited about it. And it was one of those eye-opening things. It's like, you can just go around and tell ghost stories. And that people love ghost stories, but you don't know how much they love your ghost stories. How much they're going to love this idea that they're not alone, because almost everyone, hands down, has one story that they can't wrap their head around, one event. And maybe it's just a familial event, something that happened in their circle of influence that really they struggle with. And to hear somebody else validate it and to hear somebody else say, you're not crazy. You're not, there's something very primal to the experience of ghosts, and I would dare say, from the death of the first human being, there must have been a long-term effect. He was just alive and now he's not, and trying to govern that. I oftentimes think about pets of people who have passed and how those pets continuously look and continuously try to find their owner. And it's like, there's something to that experience that is universal, that when somebody leaves, what's left behind is haunting, literally haunting.
Absolutely. But I'm in the same boat as you of I did not tell people my ghost stories at all. And honestly, I still find myself, if even my friends and stuff, I'm like, I don't really talk about my ghost stuff, I'm like, cause I don't want them to be like, oh, is there a ghost around me all the time? Like, Madison, why are you always talking about the ghosts that you see? You're a little woo,
Right.
So I find myself in that same boat, but it's true. It's Savannah in general. People who come here, they just assume everybody is a ghosty person. Or it's just probably because I wear ghost stuff all the time. I wear ghost earrings and stuff, and they see it and they're like, oh, it's December and she's wearing ghost earrings. Let me tell you my ghost story. And so it's, I found a lot of my stories that I've gathered because of those experiences of people just walking up to me or they take my tour. I love when locals take my tour because at the end of it, they're like, great, I have a excellent story to tell you. Or this weird thing happened to me while I was at work. I had a woman a couple months ago who worked at Pie Society come on my tour, and we ended up finding out it's the same woman. If you heard my story about the guy who told me about his haunted house, and then 2 weeks later,
right.
the
Barnard Street one?
Yeah, the 34th and Barnard house. Yeah, and it was her house that we found out that girl was murdered in and things like that. So if you don't know that story, go watch some previous episodes. And but basically, after I had told her that somebody was murdered in her house and that's why she's having all the experiences she's having, she was like, that makes sense. Also, while I was at work the other morning, there was, I'm there at like 6:30 a.m. because I bake all the pies. And usually it's just me and this other lady who works next door. And so I was outside taking out some like trash or whatever. And I saw her and I was like telling her like, hey, I just put a fresh pot of coffee on. Do you want any coffee? And while I'm talking to her, I see this woman dart into the building. And so immediately she's like, oh, that's weird. Like, why did someone run inside? It's literally like 7 o'clock in the morning at this point. And she's like, well, maybe it's like a homeless woman or something. And maybe she's just looking for like food or coffee or whatever. So she goes inside and Pie Society, the Little Crown by Pie Society. If you haven't been to it, it is not a large building.
No.
There is not any room to hide. So basically she walks in and she doesn't see her. So she calls out. She's like, hey, is anybody in here? I just, I saw you run in here. I want to make sure you're doing okay. And basically all she sees is the shadowy figure of a woman who's just standing there in the lobby. And then when she sees her, she runs back down the hallway, back out to the alley. And she's like, that was the experience. And I was like, so she's like, so is there any like ghosts known for that area? And I'm like, well, I mean,
Funny you should ask.
I'm like, you're in City Market. Like that's, prime time, ghost central,
And that's something that I always get because like leading a ghost tour, you'll walk around and somebody will stop you on a ghost tour and say, you got any stories about this building?
Oh my God, all the time.
And you're like, what's interesting is sometimes you have ghost stories, but they're just not stories. They're just like events and stuff. So I was once stopped on State Street and somebody points at this building. He's like, yeah, ghost stories about this building. And I'm like, I do, but there's nothing to tell. People used to see a man sitting on, there was a wooden bench thing in there. I was like, yeah, I see a man sitting on the bench. And the guy's like, yeah, you want to know who he was? And I was just like, yes. And the story that he told was that he used to work in this building. They got that bench from like when a restaurant went out of, or it's kind of junk shoppy. So they got this bench, they pulled it in, and it had this weird furrow in the back of the bench where you sit. And he said, everybody working there started having like weird experiences, seeing like when they open before sun comes up, they'd see him, and there's a guy sitting on this bench, and they go through all this stuff. Turns out that the furrow was a bullet that went through a man and was still in the bench.
Oh, Lord.
Like he had dug the bullet out of the bench, and he was like, when we pulled the bullet out of the bench, the haunting stopped. People stopped seeing him. And I was just like, that's an amazing story.
So the Pie Society that you just mentioned, that's where I met these people with the art gallery. So if you go through Pie Society, it goes into this art gallery building that has multiple galleries. And there's a downstairs and an upstairs. And I've only been on that side twice, I think. I actually used to work, our friend Casey Jones had a gallery across the way. And so I used to work there, but I knew of the one across the way. And so that's where I just ended up that day. I don't like the stairs in that building, and I couldn't tell you why, but I did not like the stairs. I'll walk up and down the stairs on the other side all day long, not a problem. Don't like the stairs on that side. So both times I've been there, I've taken the elevator. When I met those gallery owners, they told me that people get pushed down those stairs all the time.
Yeah.
People who do not believe in ghosts will just tumble down the stairs and they'll say, something pushed me. I felt it.
I've heard that story so many times because the Vinnie's, which is right around the corner, doesn't have a bathroom of their own. They actually send people into that corridor. And granted, this is usually people who are inebriated or drunk.
Right.
They'll go into this because that's where the bathrooms are, but they'll find themselves on the staircase and they'll say that they've been pushed. Someone shoved me. I'm like,
So take the elevator.
Take
Take
the
the
elevator.
elevator. Yeah, and if you see a random shadow lady running around the building, then maybe it's the same one, you know. But
She might be the pusher or the pushee.
right.
She may have been pushed down those stairs.
Well, so like the lady who I talked to, you know, she's like, I wasn't scared of her. I was just more confused. So I was like, what is going on? You know, because she genuinely thought she was going to just like give this like homeless lady, you know, a cup of coffee. Cause she's like, that happens sometimes, you know, they come by and she's like, oh, you know, I just give them something and they go on their way. But she was like, it's just weird that like she chose to stand there. And then she was like, okay, bye. You know, she's like, why did you come in the first place if you didn't want any kind of interaction? You know, and I was like, well, probably because she thought that you were leaving. And she's like, great.
Right.
You know,
Now it's time
like,
to go
Right.
rest.
Right.
Maybe she should leave out a cup of coffee for her.
Right. Oh, that'd be cute. You know?
Well, and yeah, the City Market has so many stories of, you know, a brothel.
Oh, yeah.
The fire.
What hasn't been
you
a
know.
brothel in Savannah?
Well, my favorite was right on the corner of City Market. If you go, I think it's an Anthropology now, but it used to be the 606 Cafe, and famously that place was haunted by a prostitute. That, yeah, at least everyone said that. And I was like, well, if she's not a prostitute, she's gonna be real mad. that's how she's remembered.
She's like, are you kidding me?
It's like, what?
Well, one of my friends used
I'm a lawyer.
One of my friends used to work for the Georgia Historical Society, and in her spare time, she liked to just research random things about Savannah. And unfortunately, she moved a few years ago. But one thing that she was working on was researching Savannah's red light districts because they did move around the
They
city,
did, absolutely.
Right.
where the old jail and the old police department are. That area across from there, that whole area used to be a red light district. One of the inns over there advertises like, yeah, we used to be a brothel.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
But there used to be multiple in the area.
Well, yeah, when you get to that east side, it was a pretty undesirable side of Savannah. You know, they actually had a wall that was like, this is real Savannah. You're fake Savannah. Get out. Shoo. And so, yeah, it's interesting because the red light district did move, and almost always it was an event, like a fire or, you know, a big change in the fortunes of an area, because that it's fascinating because I guess wherever there's money, the brothel is going to be.
Right.
But with a reversal, either way, if the money goes up, the brothel's forced out. If the money goes down, the brothel has to leave.
Yeah. I mean, like, it makes sense, though, that they think there's a prostitute ghost at Anthropology, because in that Jefferson Street, Jefferson Street historically is known where a lot of the prostitutes would be. I mean, so it makes sense that they'd be over there.
Oh, no, it's that whole block.
Right.
You know, because there was a time when it was in City Market proper, and then that row of buildings that is where Anthropology all the way down to the Grove, I think, was like, pick your building, any of these buildings. And it was, you know, the business was on the ground level, the businesses of whatever, the legitimate businesses, and then you go upstairs to, you know, the brothels. How many times can we say brothel in a podcast?
Right. It's like we put a brothel counter on, you know. It's
17 times.
But I mean, they also at the Escape Company right below Anthropology, they also have a couple prostitute ghosts, is what they believe, because
And John Ghost. Right? At
John
least one.
Ghost. Yeah, they call him like the trench coat guy.
Yeah, the trench guy.
Yeah, because they still see him pretty often. Kristen, who was on the podcast a while ago, who's our stage manager, she also works at the Escape Company, and she said that was like one of the first ghosts that she saw working there was the trench coat John, because he was back in the where is it? The control room. So for escape rooms, they have a control room where they can watch the guests, and, you know, if they're, you know, not doing well, they can chime in on the radio and tell them how to do better. And so guests aren't supposed to be back there. And she saw this guy in a trench coat go to the back control room, and she was like, oh, that's not right. You should not be back there. And her coworker also saw him go back there. But when they went back there, no John. So, you know, they're kind of passive ghosts in a way. They're not
Sure.
very active usually. I've noticed that a lot with our prostitute and John ghosts in Savannah. They're usually nothing more than you hearing the high heel clicks or you just see them in passing.
Right.
But
Do you think it's just residual energy?
that's kind of what I personally think, because
Absolutely.
I've never heard anybody actually have an interaction with one, but you never know. So
Where the anthropology is, when it was the 606, multiple people, there used to be a long, big mirror right outside of the bathrooms. And people would walk down the hall and see in the mirror a woman standing. But when they turned, and it's not a big hallway, so they're coming around the corner and they see a woman there. And so they're trying to avoid her, but she's not there. She's only in the mirror. And they always say the same thing. She's staring into the mirror.
that's creepy.
Which then becomes she's staring out of the mirror. She's just dead stare. And they typify that she's wearing like old-timey clothes, but that's not unusual for downtown Savannah because all the way back to the 90s, people started doing tours in costume,
Right.
in period clothing. So a lot of people thought, and plus at the time, the waitresses of 606 were wearing a very atypical clothing. It was just they all wore strange. I think they all wore tutus basically. So they're wearing strange clothing. So to come around the corner and see somebody that's not necessarily dressed like everyone else was not a weird thing. But I do remember that the guy who bought the mirror, he put it in his house, and then his house caught on fire.
Oh my God.
And the story, again, these were years in the making stories. It would come out that the story that people believed happened in that brothel was that a man beat a prostitute to death with a lantern, took the lantern and beat her to death, and it set the room on fire, which was a fire that burned down a good portion of the City Market area.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's aggressive.
It's aggressive spirit.
I mean, mirror ghosts are also just weird. Yeah. We can't get into it again, or, the internet will roast us.
You'll scare TikTok again.
Oh, Lord. Somebody wrote an article about it.
Really?
Yeah. I regularly, Google the podcast and things like that so that, I can keep up to date with things that, and I came across this really just no name kind of blog, but
Sure.
somebody had written an article and it came up with your name and my name, and I was like, that's weird. Okay, let me read the article. And they were talking about TikTok, and he basically in depth summarizes that TikTok, and and then he said, and then there's some people who truly full-heartedly believe in these people, but then there's other skeptics like myself who think that it's false, and that's what the article says. That's it. I'm like, so you took your time to write this opinion blog, but you didn't give your opinion? I'm just like... So,
Makes you sound like you're mirror ghost televangelist.
Yeah, well, and that's just it. I have no interest in changing anyone's belief structure.
Right. Well, I just think it's funny because I'm just like... I'm totally for people having a debate, and things like that of if you don't want to believe it and you have your strong opinions of this is why I don't think you're correct. I'm full-heartedly give me that article because I'm actually interested to hear the other side. But I was just you took your time to write this thorough, very thorough. They're Susie and Timmons are out here making bold claims of mirrors. And I'm just oh, goodness gracious. But I'm give me the opinion. Give me the punch at the end at least, know?
Well, because skeptic is not a stance.
Right.
It's just not. I'm skeptical. Great. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical that, calamari is a good thing. It's I have my skepticism about that. And
You should put that on your business card.
Right.
Calamari skeptic.
Calamari skeptic, and it's well, some people think it's great. Well, those people are idiots. That's
Right.
not how it works.
Right.
It does not come down to that. These are, whenever you talk about ghosts, you're really just talking about an idea that we ruminate on.
Right.
And so anybody who takes a sense or a position of authority one way or the other is not really looking at the issue. Is not really
Right.
thinking about why do we still tell ghost stories? What is the point of telling a ghost story or believing in ghosts or following ghosts or hunting ghosts or anything like that? These are ruminations on being alive, not the explanation of the unknown, because we're not going to explain it. It's not going to happen. Not in our lifetime.
Right.
I don't think.
Well, and it's...
I mean, here's hoping.
Right, exactly. And I think it's fun, too, to discuss theory because, you know, like, there are so many books and things like that. Like, it's hard for one person to know everything in the world about something that is not concrete. So, you know,
absolutely,
it's fun to discuss and banter and things like that. And I think that was really the core of this podcast, you know, is like, we just enjoy speculating about all the different things that could be.
If these microphones weren't here, we'd be doing this.
Right.
We'd be sitting around talking this and having these same kinds of observations and ideas because it's just something that we've grown accustomed to thinking about. And yeah, it does form opinions. It does form these ideas that we, you know, for lack of a better word, believe in. The word belief is a in quotations because I think we're all still searching. Like there are things we know internally and have a good understanding of, but they're all based on experience and on observation. They're not, no one's out there writing the definitive treatise on it.
Yes. So, you know, take, you know, ghostly and spiritual things with a grain of salt and just like notice when it comes up a lot or, you know, if you're reading things and you're like, oh, this same person says the same thing or this says this, it gives it a little bit more validity, you know, when multiple people have observed the same, you know, behavior from spirits or things like that. And never
discount personal experiences.
Exactly.
You know, I have terrible personal experiences with certain things that make me, you know, shy away from it. And it is not because I understand it. It's actually because I don't. You know, it's not because, oh, I know that's evil. It's because I don't have a firm grasp on all of the pieces here. And I've seen it do damage. I've seen it do harm. I've seen people harmed by it. So, yeah.
And what works for one person may not work for another.
Absolutely.
All three of us could go into a haunted location, and all three of us could have three very separate incidents.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's another thing is, individually, we are geared by everything that has come before to have a filter in front of us, the filter of what we know, what we don't know, filter of what we've experienced and haven't experienced. And that will guide us into different experiences. You know, Madison is far more adept at interacting with spirits, whereas I am hyper conscious, hyper vigilant, because I'm scared. You know, the bottom line is I get scared easily, and so I'm using a different metric to navigate any haunted situation, and a lot of that is just the concept of preservation for me, whereas it's the concept of exploration for Madison, and I feel that's the same with Eenie, is this explorative notion. I am wary. You know, I spend most of my time being very, you know, wary of the entire situation. So we do need to wrap things up, but I will leave the episode at this because something that we got a request for when we asked people to send us what they'd like to see on the podcast, somebody wanted the ghost of the day. All right.
Now, okay, I'm going to tell you this because the request was very specific of wanting to, because they find my experience with the paranormal very interesting because I have a very different experience with them. They were like, try to communicate with these spirits and see why they're there. I will tell you, if that happens, I will let you know immediately. But very rarely do the spirits that I see on a day-to-day basis have any desire to communicate. They're kind of just there. So just wanted to make that a little bit more clear of, I don't think I've specified that, you know, some of these experiences are very just quick and like, I'm like, oh, they're there, cool, you know. It's not always like me talking to them and figuring out their names or, you know, being like, so what brings you here, John? You know, it's like things like that. But my ghost of the day. So a couple weeks ago when we had Jessica Schroyer on the show, really weird occurrence that during the podcast, while we were filming, I was very distracted the whole time because standing behind Chris and I's camera over towards the curtain of the theater, there was a man with a bowler hat and a big mustache, a big handlebar mustache, standing there just staring at us the whole time. And I kept hearing in my head, I I should say, before people think I'm schizophrenic or crazy, that I have my voice of my own inner thoughts, and then there are other voices that pop in sometimes that are very much so associated with spirits because I never hear them again. So this one, haven't heard this one before, and it kept saying Atwell, 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 Atwell in my head, and I was like, can you stop? And also, typically, when a spirit is trying to contact me, or trying to give me some type of information, I get a ringing in my ear. Now, if it's my spirit guides, it's ringing in this ear. If it's just a normal spirit, it's ringing in this ear. So it was doing that, and I'm trying to listen to Jessica, trying to be a good host here, and I just have this intense ringing in my ear, and then Atwell, Atwell, Atwell going off in my head. We later, towards the end of the episode, we found out her maiden name, which, can you remind me of what the maiden name was? Because we had a conclusion here.
I should know this.
It started with D. It was
Duncan? No. It's a pretty prominent name in Savannah.
Right.
Nope, it's gone.
Well, regardless, go back and watch Jessica's episodes and you'll find out the actual name. I don't know why I can't remember her maiden name, but regardless,
Was it Dutch?
No, it was. Oh gosh. Anyways,
we'll find it.
Yeah. So point being though, it was like Chris said, a very common Savannah maiden name or Savannah family name. And I told Chris about this experience after Jessica left, and he goes, do you think that's because her family would have been a prominent family in Atwell? What we've found about Atwell being is that they're also a prominent Georgia family in general because they had the Atwell pecans.
Yeah.
And they now have a store in Savannah called Atwell's Framings and whatnot. So we're like, do you think that he heard that she was a blank family name and he was like, or he knew that she was a part of that lineage, and that's why he decided to finally show up, because we've been picking up on pieces of this Atwell trail.
Right. For those of you who don't know,
right.
Atwell actually came through the spirit box the first time we fired it up in this location. And what was strange was it came up repeatedly. It wasn't just like one Atwell. It was repeatedly Atwell in two different machines, which was very peculiar because one machine is not scanning the radio waves, and it came through as just like
that's weird.
Really odd, and it's very strange to hear that repeatedly, and that set us on a
little bit of a breadcrumb trail, it's but yeah, basically though, I had never seen the spirit before, and I've obviously never seen this man with the bowler hat and the handlebar mustache. I would have noticed that. And I thought it was weird that I know that was the last time I've seen him, is that time when Jessica was here. So Jessica
back.
Yeah, I know. Jessica, she listens to the podcast. So Jessica, while you're driving, just make a mental note like that we need to get together and bring you back in here so we can see if that's why that happened. But that's your ghost of the day, y'all. So long story, but interesting story at least. So thank you guys so much for listening, though, and making it all the way to season 3. Hopefully you had a great holiday season and your new year is going to be great. 2023, we're sending you lots of hope and joy and ghostly encounters. So with that, though, Eenie, do you have anything else that you want to plug before we sign off?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay, well, take Enie's tour and follow her.
Watch my TikToks.
Yes, watch her TikTok. She works very hard on
those. Seek out the TikToks.
Right. But with that, though, if you don't already follow us on social media, what are you doing at this point? You've made it this long without doing it. So you can find us on all social media platforms under Haunted City Podcasts. You can also find us on our website at hauntedcitypodcast.com, where we have the blog posts, we have merch, we have lots of fun things going on over there. So with that, my name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Susi.
And stay spooky, y'all.